One evening, as I was reflecting on the progress I had made and the people whose lives I had touched, I stood by the window of my office and looked out over the city. It was a quiet night, the kind where everything seemed still and peaceful. But inside, I felt the movement of change. I felt the ripples of transformation, of lives being touched, of dreams being reclaimed. The work I had done, the people I had helped, had created a force that was bigger than any individual. And in that moment, I realized that the true power of my journey wasn't just in what I had achieved, but in what I had inspired others to achieve. My victory wasn't mine alone. It was shared with every person who believed in me, with every person who had found the strength to believe in themselves. Together, we had created something powerful, something unstoppable. I was just one ripple in a vast ocean of change. But that was enough, because sometimes all it takes is one ripple to create a wave. The years had passed, and as much as I wanted to believe that my journey had reached its pinnacle, I had come to understand that growth was a constant cycle, an evolution that never truly ends. The victory I had experienced over my body, my fears, and the limitations that had once seemed insurmountable had led me to something even greater, a legacy. A legacy not of just physical triumph, but strength, hope, and resilience that would carry on long after I was gone. I had spent so much of my life focused on the idea of overcoming my own obstacles, of making it to the pain and doubt to reach the other side. But now, I realized that the true test wasn't just overcoming my own challenges. It was about how I could help others do the same. It was about what I could pass on to the next generation of dreamers, of fighters, of those who would one day face their own battles. That realization didn't come overnight. It wasn't until I began to see the ripple effect grow, spreading wider and wider, that I understood the full weight of what I had started. It wasn't just about the individual victories. It was about creating something bigger than myself, a movement that could inspire others to take control of their lives, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to become the heroes of their own stories. I was no longer just a survivor. I had become a mentor, a guide, a symbol of what could be achieved through sheer determination and belief. But even as I stood in the spotlight, I knew that my role was to show others how to step into the light themselves. My legacy would not be a statue or a monument to one woman's success. It would be a living, breathing testament to the power of human spirit and the unbreakable will to rise again. One day, as I was preparing for another speaking engagement, I thought about what I would say to the audience. There were always the standard messages, the importance of resilience, the value of perseverance. But this time, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to leave them with something that would stick long after they left the room. As I stood on stage, looking out at the sea of faces, some filled with hope, others with doubt, I spoke from my heart. I'm not here to tell you that life will be easy. It won't be. We all face moments of pain, of loss, of disappointment. But what I can tell you is that those moments don't define you. You have the power to choose how you respond to those challenges. You have the ability to rise, no matter how many times you fall. And when you do, you'll discover that you are stronger than you ever imagined. I paused for a moment, letting my words settle in the air. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a collective breath, as if everyone in the room was absorbing the truth of those words. Your strength doesn't come from being unbreakable. It comes from getting back up, from fighting when you don't think you have anything left. It comes from choosing to keep moving forward, even when the path ahead is unclear. And that strength, it doesn't just change you, it changes the world around you. As I spoke, I could see the faces of the audience shifting. Some were nodding, some had tears in their eyes. I had said what needed to be said, and in that moment, I knew that my story wasn't over, not by a long shot. It wasn't just about what I had achieved. It was about what others would achieve because of the path I had carved. It was about the people who would go on to change their own lives, their communities, their worlds, inspired by the strength I had found within myself. After the speech, a young woman approached me. She was trembling, her hand shaking as she handed me a note. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your story gave me the courage to keep fighting." I thought I was done, but I'm not. I'm just beginning. I took the note from her, a smile forming on my lips. This was the real legacy. Not the applause, not the recognition, but the lives changed. The people who, like me, would rise. The impact of my journey stretched far beyond anything I had imagined when I first lay in that hospital bed, convinced that my world had ended. But now, standing before so many others, I knew that my story wasn't just mine. It was theirs too. It was the story of anyone who had ever faced a challenge, anyone who had ever doubted their ability to rise, anyone who had ever wondered if they were strong enough to keep going. My legacy wasn't about how far I had come. It was about how far others would go because of the strength they found in me. And in them, I saw the future. A future of endless possibilities, of challenges overcome, of lives transformed by the simple act of choosing to believe. As I left the stage that day, my heart was full. I had no doubt that the ripples I had set in motion would continue to spread. And someday, someone else would stand where I had stood, sharing their story, inspiring others, and continuing the cycle of strength, hope, and resilience. And so, the legacy of strength carried on, through every life touched, every hand held, every heart inspired. My journey may have started with a single step, but it had led to a movement that would never stop, as long as there were people willing to rise. As time passed, I started to realize that my journey had taken on a life of its own. The personal struggles and triumphs that had once defined me had expanded into something that reached far beyond my own life. I had stepped into the role of someone who could influence the future, not just through speeches and public appearances, but through everyday interactions, through the simple act of living my truth. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It wasn't about achieving some lofty goal or checking off boxes on a list. It was about possibility. I had set out to prove that anything was possible, even when it seemed impossible. And in the process, I had unlocked a door for others to walk through, a door that led to a life without limits. When I had first been told that I would never walk again, the world seemed to close in on me. I couldn't imagine a future that wasn't defined by what I had lost. The idea of a life without boundaries felt so distant, so foreign. But now, standing here today, I knew that the boundaries were never as real as I thought they were. They were merely illusions, products of fear, doubt, and the expectations that others placed upon me. The more I helped others through their own journeys, the more I saw that the true boundaries in life weren't physical at all. They were mental, emotional, and sometimes cultural. It wasn't just about being able to walk again. It was about breaking free from the mental constraints that held people back from achieving greatness. In the years since I had started speaking, my focus had shifted. I had seen the way people transformed when they believed that they were capable of more, when they realized that the limitations they had placed on themselves were just walls that could be torn down with time, effort, and belief. I wasn't just helping people move physically. I was helping them move beyond the barriers they had built within their minds. One day, as I walked through the city, taking in the bustle of everyday life, I stopped at a familiar bench. It was the same bench where I had sat during my darkest days, when the world felt impossibly heavy, and I wondered if I would ever feel whole again. Back then, the idea of walking in the park, of simply being a part of the world, seemed like a distant dream. But now, here I was, standing, moving, and feeling alive. The bench was no longer a symbol of defeat for me. It had become a marker of progress, a reminder that I had come so far. I sat down, letting the cool breeze brush against my face, and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I thought about the people I had met, the lives I had touched, and the countless others who've been inspired by my story to keep moving forward in their own lives. And then I realized I hadn't just been walking for myself. I had been walking for all of them. Every person who had ever doubted their strength. Every person who had ever wondered if they were capable of change. Every step I took was a reminder that we all have the power to shape our futures, no matter where we start from. The future, I realized, was full of endless possibilities. There were no boundaries, no limits, no end of potential for growth and transformation. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first entered that hospital room. I wasn't even the same person I was a year ago. I had grown in ways I hadn't expected, and the future was ripe with opportunity. I got up from the bench and began walking again, feeling the ground beneath my feet, feeling the rhythm of each step. I knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges. Life would never be without its obstacles. But now, I understood something that I hadn't understood before. Challenges weren't something to fear. They were something to embrace. Every challenge was a chance to break through another boundary, to redefine what was possible. And as long as I kept moving forward, as long as I continued to believe in myself and in the potential of others, the future would always be a place of endless possibility. As I walked through the park, the world around me seemed full of promise. The people I saw, some laughing, some walking with purpose, some simply enjoying the moment, were all living their own stories. They didn't know it, but they were all part of the same journey, the journey toward a life without boundaries. And I knew in that moment that my story wasn't over. It had just begun. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Speaking engagements, community outreach, new projects, and people constantly reaching out, eager to hear my story or share their own. But amidst the whirlwind, I began to realize that the journey I had started was no longer just about personal recovery or individual victories. It was about something bigger, a movement, a collective understanding that we were all capable of breaking through whatever limits had been placed on us. I spent hours with individuals and groups, teaching them how to see beyond their circumstances. Whether they were dealing with physical challenges, mental barriers, or emotional scars, I saw the same thing in their eyes that I had once seen in my own. Fear, doubt, the belief that there was no way out. And each time, I reminded them of the most important lesson I had learned. That limits were not walls. They were opportunities to discover new strengths, new possibilities. As I reflected on how far I had come, I also started to think about the future, not just for myself, but for the people who had come to me for guidance. What would their futures look like if they could embrace the idea that limits were meant to be pushed, not feared? What if they saw every challenge as a stepping stone rather than an obstacle? One morning, I received a message from a young man named David. He had been in a car accident and had lost the use of his legs. He had heard my story and decided to reach out. He wasn't looking for pity. He wasn't asking for sympathy. What he wanted was answers. Answers to how he could move forward, how he could rebuild his life, how he could learn to see beyond the limits of his body. I met with David, and as we talked, I could feel his pain, but I also felt his hunger for change. He wasn't giving up. He was angry, yes, but that anger wasn't directed at the world. It was directed at the idea that his life was over, that his story had reached its conclusion. I could relate to that feeling. I had once felt that same rage, the belief that nothing would ever be the same again. But as I listened to David, I also saw something else. The spark of hope, the ember belief that change was possible. I took him through the same steps I had followed. We talked about his fears, his doubts, and then we worked on his physical therapy. But more than that, we worked on his mindset. I showed him how to visualize the future, how to see the life he wanted not as a distant dream, but as a tangible reality that was waiting for him to claim it. We broke down his goals into small, manageable steps, just as I had done for myself. In the weeks that followed, David began to make progress. Small at first, but with each victory, no matter how minor, he grew more confident. He started using a wheelchair with more ease, and when he was ready, we worked on transferring to a walker. He smiled more. He started to believe again. That was the moment I realized something. The work I was doing, the people I was helping, it wasn't just about overcoming physical challenges. It was about teaching people to break the boundaries they had placed on their own lives. It was about showing them that there was always a way forward, even when the path seemed impossible to see. And then there was the day I received a call from the organizers of an international conference on disability and rehabilitation. They invited me to speak as a keynote speaker, a moment I had dreamed of since I began this journey. But this wasn't just about my story. This was an opportunity to share the lessons I had learned with a global audience. It was a chance to challenge the world's view on disability and what it truly meant to be limited. As I prepared for speech, I reflected on how much my own perspective had shifted over the years. In the beginning, I had thought of myself as a survivor, someone who had beaten the odds. But now, I saw myself as something more. I was an example of what was possible when you refused to accept limitations. I was a catalyst for change, not just for myself, but for countless others who needed to hear that they could overcome whatever challenges they faced. When the day of the conference arrived, I stood before a packed audience, ready to speak. I felt the weight of their expectations, but I also felt the strength of my own conviction. This wasn't just a speech. It was a call to action. I shared my story, the hospital bed, the diagnosis, the pain, the struggle. But then I shared the truth, that my journey wasn't about walking again. It was about seeing beyond what the world told me I couldn't do. It was about finding freedom in the face of limitations, about realizing that I had the power to redefine my own narrative. I talked about the importance of mindset, of breaking down the mental barriers that often held us back far more than the physical ones. None of us are limited by what we can see. I told the audience, we are only limited by what we believe. And once we begin to change that belief, we open up a world of possibilities. The only limits that exist are the ones we place on ourselves. And I'm here to tell you that those limits are meant to be broken. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't just for me. It was for every person in that room who'd been inspired to believe that they could live a life without boundaries. As I left the stage that day, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I had done more than just speak. I had sparked something. I had planted the seeds of change, and I knew that those seeds would grow, that they would spread far beyond that conference room. I realized that the journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. There were still so many people to reach, so many lives to touch, so many barriers to break down. The future was still full of challenges, but was also full of infinite possibility. As I looked ahead, I knew one thing for certain. The only limits I would face in the future were the ones I chose to accept. And I had long since made the choice to live without boundaries. The path I had walked was one of transformation, not just for me, but for those who had followed my journey. The more I reflected on the impact of my work, the more I realized that my story was not a finished tale. It was an ongoing journey, one that would continue to evolve with each person who found inspiration in it. And in the quiet moments when the noise of the world calmed, I thought about the many paths that still lay ahead, waiting to be written. For so long, I had believed that my life had been defined by the moment of my injury, that one instant that had changed everything. But the truth was that my life had always been in motion, always shifting, always evolving. Every step, every choice, every moment had led to this point. And the future was just another chapter in a story that was constantly being rewritten. I had once thought that the hardest part of my journey would be the physical struggle, the pain of relearning how to walk, the frustration of not being able to do the things I once took for granted. But as time went on, I realized that the hardest part wasn't the physical challenge. It was the emotional and mental work of rebuilding my sense of self. It was about overcoming the internal barriers, the doubts that whispered that I would never be enough, that I would always be defined by what I had lost. Now, I understood that the true measure of strength wasn't about the distance you could run, the number of steps you could take, or how quickly you could overcome obstacles. It was about the ability to embrace change, to grow through the struggles, and keep moving forward even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. I thought about the people I had met along the way, the ones who had inspired me just as much as I had inspired them. David, the young man who had reached out to me after his accident, was one of those people. He had come a long way, his recovery both physical and emotional. But it wasn't just his progress that filled me with pride. It was the way he had begun to inspire others, the way his story was now shaping the lives of those who came after him. I had helped him find his strength, but he had found his voice, and that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. It wasn't about having a single perfect moment of triumph. It was about creating a ripple effect, where one person's journey sparked the courage and determination in others to start their own. I had been that spark for so many. But I knew that it wasn't my light alone that mattered. It was the light of all the people who had been touched by my story and had gone on to touch others. The world had opened up in ways I hadn't imagined. There were opportunities now that went beyond speaking engagements and interviews. I had started working with organizations that focus on disability advocacy, helping to change policies, break down societal barriers, and create a more inclusive world for people of all abilities. The work wasn't always easy, it was slow, and it required persistence. But I knew that it was necessary. It wasn't enough to just inspire people. It was time to change the systems that had kept them in the shadows. As I began to dig deeper into this advocacy work, I found myself drawn to something unexpected: education, I had spent my life learning, not just in the traditional sense, but in the most profound way, learning to adapt, to grow, to challenge the status quo. And now, I realized that I could pass on those lessons to the next generation. I could teach them that there were no limits to what they could achieve, no matter the circumstances they faced. I had always believed that education was the key to empowerment. But now, I saw it from a new perspective. Education wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about teaching people to think critically, to question, to challenge, and to redefine what was possible. It was about teaching them to embrace the unknown, to forge their own paths without fear of failure, without fear of judgment. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my journey had come full circle. I had started out searching for answers, trying to make sense of my own suffering and pain. But now, I was helping others find their answers, teaching them to see the world as a place full of potential, not limitations. I was helping them write their own stories, just as I had rewritten mine. And then one evening, as I was walking to the park, I saw a group of young children playing soccer. There was one boy who seemed different. He was in a wheelchair, but he was playing just as hard as everyone else, shouting encouragement to his teammates. It reminded me of where I had been, of how I had once thought that my life was over. But now, I saw something in this boy's determination that filled me with hope. It was a sign of progress, a sign that the world was changing, slowly but surely. I walked over to him, smiling as he caught sight of me. "You're playing really well," I said, nodding toward his wheelchair. He grinned. "I don't need legs to play soccer." Those words, simple yet profound, struck me deeply. It was the same message I had spent years trying to share, that limitations were a matter of perspective. We didn't need to conform to the world's idea of what we should be or what we could do. We only needed to embrace the possibilities that existed within us. As I watched him play, I realized that the path I had walked was only one of many. There were countless stories to be told, countless journeys yet to be completed. The future was unwritten, but it was full of promise. And as long as people continued to rise, to challenge themselves, to break free from their self-imposed boundaries, the world would continue to change. I stood there, watching the children run and play, feeling the weight of everything I had experienced and everything that was still to come. The journey was never truly over. It was just beginning, and the world was wide open. It had been years since I first heard the doctor's words, the verdict that had sent my world spiraling. But the person I was now seemed so far removed from the person I had been back then. I had crossed countless thresholds, confronted every fear, and grown stronger with each challenge I faced. Yet there was still something inside me, a burning desire to keep pushing further, to test the limits that seemed to recede every time I reached one. The more I had accomplished, the more I understood that true growth didn't come from reaching the finish line. It came from constantly redefining what the finish line was. It wasn't a single goal or milestone that defined me anymore. It was a journey, the endless pursuit of reaching new heights, of finding new boundaries to break, and new mountains to climb. I had been running marathons, speaking at global events, and helping people rebuild their lives. But I felt the pull to go further, to do more. The world was vast, and I had only scratched the surface of what was possible. It wasn't about physical limits anymore. It was about how far I could stretch my own sense of possibility. The only way to know how far I could go was to keep going. That's when I decided to take on something that terrified me. I would climb a mountain, not just any mountain, a massive, treacherous peak that would test every part of me. I had heard before, a summit known for its difficulty, its unpredictable weather, and its extreme conditions. But that was exactly why I chose it. If I could stand on that summit, look out at the world from the highest point, it would be a tangible reminder how far I come and how much farther I could still go. The decision to climb the mountain wasn't made lightly. I knew the risks. I knew the toll it would take on my body, especially given the physical therapy I had undergone. But what was a mountain compared to mountains I had already climbed? Metaphorically speaking, my physical limitations no longer dictated the course of my life. The mental and emotional limits, though, those were the real mountains. If I could conquer those, I could conquer anything. So I started preparing. The physical training was grueling. It was one thing to walk and run again, but climbing a mountain, that required endurance and strength in ways I hadn't considered. But I threw myself into it, working with trainers, learning about the techniques, and slowly building the strength and stamina needed for climb. It was a different kind of challenge, one that required more than just willpower. It required patience, persistence, and humility. In the weeks leading up to the climb, I often found myself thinking about the bigger picture. This mountain wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had ever felt like they couldn't do something. It was for the people who had faced impossible odds, who had been told they were incapable of achieving their dreams. This was proof that no matter how tall or daunting the obstacles were, they could be overcome. The day of the climb arrived, and with it, a storm of emotions. I stood at the base of the mountain, looking up at its towering peak. The air was thin, the weather frigid, and the path ahead looked treacherous. I knew there would be moments of doubt, times when the weight to climb would feel unbearable. But I also knew that this was exactly what I had prepared for. This was my moment, not just to conquer a mountain, but to prove once and for all that nothing could stop me from reaching new heights. The climb was grueling, more difficult than I had imagined. The higher I ascended, the colder it became and the thinner the air grew. But with every step, I felt myself becoming more connected to the mountain, becoming more connected to my own journey. The struggle was real, but it wasn't about the summit anymore. It was about the fight, the perseverance, the belief that I could keep moving forward despite the challenges. There were moments when I wanted to quit, when my body screamed for rest and my mind filled with doubts. But I reminded myself of everything I had overcome, of all the obstacles I had conquered, and I pushed forward. The physical challenge was immense, but the mental strength required was far greater. Each step was an affirmation of my strength, a testament to my resilience, and a reminder how far I had come from that hospital bed where I had first been told I would never walk again. When I finally reached the summit, standing there on the peak, the world seemed to unfold beneath me. The view was unlike anything I had ever experienced, vast, endless, and breathtaking. But what struck me the most wasn't the view of the world below. It was a realization that I had reached this height because I refused to stop climbing. The mountain wasn't just a physical one. It was a symbol of everything I had fought to overcome. In that moment, I realized that the true summit wasn't just about what was achieved. It was about the person I had become in the process. The mountain was just another metaphor for life's challenges. The climb itself, the persistence, the refusal to accept failure, those were the things that defined my journey. The summit was just the icing on the cake. As I stood there, taking in the view, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I had done it. I had reached the highest point. And in doing so, I had proven to myself that no challenge was too great, no dream too impossible. The summit wasn't the end. It was simply a marker on a road that would continue to stretch out in front of me, full of new heights to reach, new mountains to climb, and new barriers to break. And as I descended from that peak, I knew that the journey was far from over. It had only just begun. The descent from the mountain was almost as challenging as the climb. The physical strain of coming down, the careful steps required to avoid slipping on loose rocks, and the mental fatigue from the journey's toll. All of it was a reminder that success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about navigating every step of the journey, whether up or down, with the same resolve and purpose. As I made my way back down, I found myself reflecting on something deeper. The summit had felt like a monumental achievement, but it was also a fleeting moment. The higher I went, the clearer it became that there would always be another summit, another challenge, another goal on the horizon. Reaching the top didn't signal the end of my journey. It simply marked the beginning of a new chapter. I had climbed this mountain for myself, yes, but I had also climbed it for those who couldn't. For those who had been told they couldn't do something, who had been made to feel small or incapable. I had climbed it to show them that no matter how insurmountable the odds seemed, there was always a way forward. That belief, that drive, would continue to fuel me long after I left the mountain behind. By the time I returned to the base camp, my body was tired, my muscles sore, but my heart felt light, free. It wasn't the physical strength that had carried me to the top. It was the mental fortitude, the determination that had grown stronger with every challenge I had faced. The mountain had tested me, but had also reaffirmed something crucial: the infinite nature of the journey. There would always be another mountain, and I would keep climbing, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The days that followed were filled with reflection and gratitude. I had accomplished something incredible, but more than that, I had learned something profound. I had learned that my journey wasn't defined by the peaks I conquered, but by the way I chose to navigate the valleys in between. The moments of doubt, the hardships, the setbacks, those were the true tests of character. And those were the moments that shaped who I had become. Back at home, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the world felt different. The colors were brighter, the air fresher, and every moment seemed to carry a deeper sense of purpose. I found myself thinking about the next steps, not just for my personal life, but for my mission. I had spoken at countless events, shared my story, and touched lives, but there was still more to do. There was still more to give. I began to plan new initiatives, ways to reach people on a larger scale. Physical therapy was still my heart's work, but now I had expanded my focus to the mental and emotional aspects of recovery. It wasn't enough to just heal the body. True healing came from within, and that was a message I wanted to spread far and wide. People needed to know that healing was a holistic process, one that involved not just the physical, but also the emotional and psychological rebuilding that came with overcoming adversity. The journey I had started years ago was evolving into something far greater than I could have imagined. It wasn't about a single event or achievement. It was about a movement. It was about showing the world that limits were just opportunities waiting to be defied, and that every person, no matter their circumstance, had the power to rewrite their story. And just as the mountain had no true summit, neither did my journey. I realized that there would always be challenges ahead, always new peaks to climb. But it was no longer about the destination. It was about the journey itself. The learning, the growing, the becoming. The journey was infinite, and that's what made it beautiful. I began to expand my reach, working with schools, communities, and organizations to raise awareness about disability advocacy, mental health, and resilience. I launched workshops, began partnering with foundations that focus on accessible sports, and worked on developing programs that help others find the same strength and determination I had discovered in myself. Through it all, I kept reminding myself that every step was progress. Every day I woke up, I was further along than I had been the day before. Some days the progress felt small, almost imperceptible, but I knew that it was still moving forward. It wasn't about the end goal. It was about the person I was becoming in the process. I thought about the people who had followed my journey, who had cheered me on from the sidelines, who had drawn strength from my story. They were the reason I kept going, the reason I kept pushing forward. I wanted to show them that they, too, could defy the odds. They, too, could rewrite their stories and climb their own mountains. And then one day, I found myself standing at the base of another mountain. This one metaphorical, but no less daunting. It was a mountain of self-doubt, of wondering if I had done enough, if I had reached enough people, if my story had truly made a lasting impact. But instead of turning away, I faced it head-on. I realized that the true journey wasn't about reaching a particular peak or receiving accolades. It was about the difference I had made in the lives of others. It was about showing them that they were capable of more than they could ever imagine. The legacy I wanted to leave was not one of fame or recognition. It was a legacy of empowerment. As I stood at the foot of this new mountain, I took a deep breath and smiled. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had climbed literal mountains, faced fears, and defied expectations. This metaphorical mountain was just another challenge to conquer, another opportunity to grow. The journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And no matter where it took me, I knew one thing for sure: I would keep climbing. I had spent so many years defining myself by the walls I had broken down, the mountains I climbed, and the barriers I had shattered. But one truth became clear. The journey was about living beyond limits, not just breaking through them. It wasn't just about overcoming obstacles. It was about redefining what was possible in the first place. In the years that followed my mountain climb, I began to shift my perspective entirely. It wasn't just about resilience anymore. It was about fulfillment. It was about learning how to live not as someone who had been held back, but as someone who had never been bound by limits to begin with. The lessons I had learned in my physical and mental recovery were profound, but now I wanted to teach people how to not just survive, but to thrive. My work began to reflect this new understanding. I no longer saw the world in terms of what I'd overcome. I saw it in terms of what I could create. What could I bring to the world? What new possibilities could I introduce, not just for myself, but for everyone who looked to me for inspiration? I began focusing more on community building. The work I did with individuals who had faced similar struggles was powerful, but I knew I could amplify that impact by encouraging collective empowerment. I connected with organizations, athletes, and advocates from different fields who, like me, believed in the strength of the human spirit to transcend the physical and mental challenges life presented. We worked together to create programs that nurtured hope and resilience, that helped people realize they weren't defined by their setbacks, but by their determination to rise. At the same time, I made a point to regularly check in with myself. It was easy to get caught up in the momentum of growth, to keep moving forward, to keep pushing. But I had learned the hard way that rest and reflection were just as important as action. I began to take time for stillness, to meditate, and to journal about where I was and where I wanted to go. It was through these quiet moments that I could recalibrate, realign my goals, and recognize when I was losing sight of what mattered most. I also spent more time connecting with the people who have been my rock throughout this journey. My family, my friends, my mentors. I took time to express gratitude to them, not just for their support during the tough times, but for their role in my continued growth. I realized that relationships were the foundation of everything, and that no matter how high I reached or how many people I inspired, I would always need the people around me to help ground me. One of the greatest joys of my life came when I saw others start their own journeys. People who had once felt hopeless, who had watched my story from afar, now began to believe in their own strength. I received messages, letters, and emails from people all over the world, telling me that they had been inspired to take their first steps, whether it was toward running, starting a new career, or simply believing in their ability to overcome their fears. Some had gone on to become leaders themselves, passing the torch of inspiration forward. There was nothing more rewarding than hearing that my journey had inspired someone else to believe in their own. But living without limits wasn't just about what I did for others. It was about what I continued to do for myself. I knew that if I wasn't pushing my own boundaries, I couldn't truly inspire others to push theirs. And so, I kept seeking out new experiences, new challenges, and new ways to grow. One of those experiences came when I was invited to participate in an ultra-marathon. The idea terrified me at first. I had run marathons, yes, but this was a race that stretched for days. It involved running through extreme conditions, over terrain that tested both endurance and mental strength. But something inside me knew I had to do it. It wasn't about proving myself to anyone else. It was about proving to myself that I could continue to break my own records. I trained relentlessly. It wasn't easy. There were days when my body protested, when I doubted my ability to keep going. But I pushed through, just as I had done in every other challenge before. Each training session became a meditation in persistence. Every step was a reminder that I could keep moving forward, no matter how far the finish line seemed. On the day of the race, the reality hit me like a wave. This wasn't just about running. It was about confronting every fear I had, every doubt, and every moment where I thought I couldn't go any further. The first few miles were exhilarating, but the true test came when the fatigue started to set in. My legs burned, my mind screamed for me to stop, but I refused. I reminded myself of all the times I'd been told I couldn't, and how I had proved them wrong. When I crossed the finish line after days of running, the sense of accomplishment was indescribable. It wasn't just the achievement itself. It was a recognition that I had once again defied what I believed was possible for myself. I wasn't just running a race. I was living a life without limits. The ultramarathon was just another chapter in a long story of growth and reinvention. It was a testament to the fact that there would always be new goals to strive for, new heights to reach. But no matter what I accomplished, the real victory lay in the freedom I felt. The freedom to live, to dream, and to never be confined by anything. As I reflected on everything I had done and everything I had yet to do, I realized that I had not only reclaimed my body, my strength, and my health, I had reclaimed my life. But more importantly, I had given myself the gift of possibility. The possibility to dream bigger, to reach farther, and to keep pushing, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. In that moment, I knew that my journey would never truly end. There would always be new mountains to climb, new limits to push, and new people to inspire. But no matter where life took me, I would always live without limits. The years after the ultramarathon passed, in a blur of activity, growth, and connection. But despite the whirlwind of new challenges, goals, and triumphs, I found myself reflecting on the same question again and again. What was a legacy I wanted to leave behind? It wasn't the trophies or the medals, the accolades or the praise that I was truly concerned about. It wasn't the physical achievements that had defined me. It was an intangible impact, the lasting influence I could have on others, the way I could inspire people to believe that no matter what they faced, they had the power to rise above it. I had spent so much time focused on my own journey, on pushing my own boundaries, but now I was driven by the desire to inspire others to do the same. It became clear that I wanted my legacy to be about empowering others to find their own strength, to unlock their own potential, and understand that limits were nothing more than a challenge waiting to be conquered. One evening, I sat down with a pen and a notebook, as I often did when I needed clarity. I wrote the word legacy at the top of the page, underlined it, and paused. What did it really mean to leave a legacy? What was I trying to achieve beyond my personal triumphs? The answer came quickly. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about changing lives in a way that rippled outward, that continued long after I was gone. I thought about the people who had supported me, my family, friends, mentors, and the way their belief in me had fueled my determination. But more than that, I thought about the countless individuals I had met along the way, the people who would come up to me after speeches or events, who had shared their own struggles and told me that I had given them the courage to keep going. Their words stayed with me, a constant reminder that the journey I had embarked on wasn't just mine. It was shared by anyone who had ever faced adversity. And so, I made a decision. I would establish a foundation, one that would help provide resources, support, and opportunities for people dealing with physical and emotional challenges. The goal wasn't just to offer financial aid, but to provide people with the tools they needed to rebuild their lives, to reignite their sense of purpose, and to give them the courage to pursue their own version of a life without limits. The foundation would focus on several areas: providing access to physical therapy and rehabilitation, offering mentorship and coaching, creating educational programs, and offering grants for those pursuing athletic goals or personal growth projects. It was my way of passing the torch, of ensuring that the opportunities one had fought for would be available to others. Launching the foundation was an emotional experience for me. It felt like a culmination of everything I had learned, everything I had fought for. It was a manifestation of my belief in the power of resilience and possibility. But it also felt like the beginning of something much larger, something that would grow far beyond anything I could imagine. In the years that followed, I watched as the foundation began to make a real difference. We helped individuals reclaim their health, their independence, and their confidence. We supported athletes who had faced injury and helped them return to their sports. We worked with children and families who have been affected by disability, offering them not only financial support, but also the emotional and mental tools to navigate the challenges they faced. But perhaps the most fulfilling part of the foundation was the mentorship programs we developed. It was one thing to provide resources. It was another to create a space where people could connect, share their stories, and support one another. The mentorship network was built on the idea that every person had something valuable to offer, and that by helping each other, we could all move forward together. In time, the foundation grew into a global movement, one that reached people across continents, cultures, and backgrounds. We worked with communities from every corner of the world, offering the same message of hope and possibility, of living without limits, no matter what your circumstances were. But what filled me with the most pride wasn't the number of people we helped. It was the stories of people who had once believed their lives were defined by their challenges, and who now saw those challenges as opportunities for growth. The stories of individuals who had dared to believe in themselves, who had pushed past the limits they had once accepted as truth, and who now were living lives filled with purpose, passion, and possibility. As I sat back and looked at everything we had accomplished, I realized that this was the true legacy I had wanted to create, not just the foundation itself, but the mindset behind it. The belief that no one should ever feel trapped by their circumstances. That no one should feel as though their dreams were out of reach. That everyone, no matter their starting point, could find the strength to rise, to keep going, and to live without limits. In many ways, I had come full circle. The person who once couldn't walk, the person who'd been told their dreams were impossible, had now become the person who was helping others turn their dreams into reality. And while the journey was never easy, there were still challenges, still moments of doubt. I had come to understand that the beauty of life wasn't in avoiding obstacles, but in how we overcame them. The final chapter of my journey wasn't about closing a door. It was about opening more. It was about creating a ripple effect that would continue long after I was gone, spreading hope, strength, and resilience wherever was needed. And as I continued to live without limits, I knew one thing for sure. The true beauty of life was in its infinite potential. There were always more mountains to climb, always more opportunities to grow, and always more lives to touch. I had reclaimed my life, and now I was helping others do the same. The legacy of possibility wasn't just about what I had done. It was about what was yet to be done. And with every step I took, I knew that the journey was far from over. As the years went on, I continued to feel the tug of a deeper purpose. My foundation was thriving. My personal journey of growth was ongoing, and yet a part of me felt like there was something more, something greater still waiting to be discovered. The foundation was incredible, but it wasn't the only way I could make a lasting impact. I began to sense that my own evolution was only a piece of the puzzle. There was an even bigger story to tell, one that stretched across boundaries, borders, and limitations that only existed in our minds. One morning, as I sat in my office, reviewing applications for a new round of grant from the foundation, I received a message from an old mentor of mine, a man who had guided me early in my recovery. He had always pushed me to reach higher, to think bigger. He had been the first to suggest that I could speak on larger platforms, that my story had the power to inspire people beyond those who had experienced physical setbacks. The message was simple. It's time. The world needs you to reach further. The words hit me hard. They stirred something deep inside me, a sense that the work I had done so far was only the beginning. What if I could do more than just help people in my community, or those who directly sought me out? What if I could reach the millions of people who were struggling, who felt like I once did, trapped by their own limitations, paralyzed by fear, or weighed down by doubt? That afternoon, I made the decision. It was time to step out of my comfort zone, to challenge myself in new ways. I would take my message global. I would not only continue to inspire people through my story, but I would share the tools, the mindset, and the strategies that had helped me not just survive, but thrive. I decided to write a book, a guide that would blend my personal journey with actionable steps that anyone could take to begin living without limits. I wanted to create something tangible, something people could turn to when they needed motivation, when they felt like giving up, when the world seemed too big and too challenging. The process of writing the book was cathartic. As I recounted my darkest moments, I realized how far I had come, not just in terms of physical recovery, but in the way I viewed the world. Each chapter one wrote became a reflection of my growth, a deeper understanding of what it meant to not just overcome adversity, but to reshape the very concept of what was possible. The book was a mixture of memoir and self-help. I shared intimate details about my struggles with physical therapy, my doubts, and the challenges I faced in rebuilding my body. But I also offered insights into the mental shifts I had to make, how I had to change the way I thought about pain, about setbacks, about fear. I spoke about the importance of resilience, but also about the necessity of rest, of knowing when to push forward and when to pause. I spoke about finding purpose in the midst of chaos and discovering the incredible power of belief in yourself, even when the world tells you that you can't. When the book was published, I received messages from people across the world, some from countries I had never even visited, from communities I had never imagined reaching. The impact of the book was far beyond what I could have anticipated. It became more than just a bestseller. It became a movement. People began to see that their circumstances did not define their potential. The limits they had placed on themselves, the doubts they carried, could be rewritten. The success of the book led to something even bigger. Invitations flooded in for speaking engagements, conferences, corporate retreats, schools, and rehabilitation centers. I found myself standing in front of crowds of people, all eager to hear what I had to say about living without limits. The moment I stepped onto those stages, I realized something profound. This was not just about me. It was about a collective awakening, a shared journey towards something greater. Through those speaking engagements, I met people who were in the midst of their own struggles, their own battles. Some were recovering from injuries like mine. Others were battling mental health challenges, facing career setbacks, or dealing with personal loss. But the one common thread was that they all felt limited in some way. It was in those moments, in the rawness of their stories, that I realized my true purpose. I was not just sharing my journey. I was giving them permission to rewrite their own stories, to see themselves as capable of more than they had ever imagined. One particularly powerful moment came when I spoke at a youth rehabilitation center. A group of young adults, some of whom had been paralyzed from accidents, sat in front of me as I spoke about my own journey. One young man raised his hand. He shared that he had once been an athlete just like me, and that the idea of never walking again had crushed him. He asked, "How did you push through? How did you keep going?" The question took me back to my own darkest moments, when I had questioned whether it was worth it. I paused, took a breath, and replied, "I didn't push through because I thought I could walk again. I pushed through because I believed I could live again." And that belief changed everything. That moment, seeing the light in his eyes as he understood the power of perspective, was one of the most humbling of my career. I realized that my legacy wasn't just about the book, the speeches, or the foundation. It was about the ripple effect of empowering people to change their own lives, to see beyond their current circumstances, and to believe that they too could live without limits. As I continue my global work, I also began to invest in partnerships with other thought leaders and change makers in fields like mental health, education, and innovation. Together, we created new initiatives that merged personal growth with practical resources, ways for individuals to not only envision a life without limits, but to start living it step by step, day by day. And as the horizon continued to expand, I realized that the journey I had embarked on was far from over. It had only just begun. Every person I met, every story I heard, reminded me that no matter how much I had achieved, there was always more to do, more lives to touch, more boundaries to break. The infinite horizon was waiting. As the years rolled by, I started to see the world differently. The limitations we put on ourselves, whether because of our past, our circumstances, or the voices of doubt around us, weren't inherent truths. They were simply stories we told ourselves. And just like every story, they could be rewritten. I had seen this firsthand, through the lives of those I met and worked with, from the young man at the rehabilitation center to the business leaders who had once felt confined by their failures. I watched as people shattered the mental cages they'd built for themselves. It wasn't about magic or shortcuts. It was about the realization that we are all capable of far more than we think. It was about seeing possibility where others saw barriers, strength where others saw weakness. The foundation continued to grow, expanding its reach. We were able to create global initiatives, from providing scholarships to aspiring athletes who had suffered injuries to offering mental health resources to those battling depression and anxiety. We hosted workshops and training programs, teaching not just the physical aspect of recovery, but the mental toughness required to push through life's toughest moments. In the process, I found myself transforming as well. I had started this journey with the goal of reclaiming my body, but what I found was far greater than physical recovery. It was a reclamation of my soul, my spirit, and my purpose. I was living fully, embracing every opportunity, and empowering others to do the same. I had moved beyond the constraints of my past. I had become not just someone who had overcome paralysis, but someone who had rewritten their entire life story. And in doing so, I helped others find the courage to rewrite theirs. One of the most profound moments of my life came when I received an invitation to speak at the United Nations. I had shared my story with thousands of people before, but this was different. This was a platform to speak not just to individuals, but to nations. It was a chance to share the message of possibility on a global scale, to challenge the entire world's perceptions of ability and potential. The event itself was an incredible experience. As I stood in front of the international leaders, experts, and change makers, I realized that the journey I had taken, from that hospital bed to the stage, had been about more than my own recovery. It had been about something much bigger. It had been about shifting the global conversation around disability, ability, and human potential. It had been about proving that limitations were not permanent truths, but temporary obstacles to overcome. But as I spoke to the crowd, I realized that the true power wasn't in my words. It was in the actions of those who heard them. It was in the people who would leave that room and begin to see themselves as capable of achieving greatness, regardless of their struggles. It was in the communities that would rise up and break down the barriers they had built around those perceived as less than. It was in the world I was helping to create, one that embraced the infinite possibilities in all of us. After that speech, I continued to travel the world, meeting more incredible people who were proving that the impossible was just a challenge waiting to be conquered. People who had been told they'd never walk again, who had been told they were too old, too broken, too weak. And yet, they defied the odds just as I had. And then, one day, I stood at the edge of a mountain watching the sunrise. The view was breathtaking, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, the air crisp and clear. As I took in the beauty, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had come so far from the person I once was, the person who believed she would never walk again. And now, I stood here at the top of my own mountain, knowing that every step of my journey had led me to this moment. I understood now that life wasn't about reaching a single destination. It was about the journey itself, the way we learned, grew, and evolved along the way. It was about the people we touched, the lives we changed, and the legacy we left behind. The horizon before me was infinite, an expanse of potential, waiting to be explored, discovered, and lived. The road ahead would be long, but that's what made it beautiful. Every day was a chance to keep moving forward, to continue rewriting the story of who I was, and to inspire others to do the same. The journey would never truly end. As long as I had breath in my lungs, there would always be another challenge, another opportunity to grow, and another person to help along the way. I was no longer defined by my past, my limitations, or the expectations others had of me. I was defined by the belief that anything was possible, and that belief would fuel me for the rest of my life. I took a deep breath, feeling the wind in my hair, and smiled. The world was full of limits, but I was living proof that they were meant to be broken.